The roar of the engine echoed off the walls of Monte Carlo's iconic streets. Lewis Hamilton had just crossed the finish line, claiming another legendary win at the Monaco Grand Prix. The crowd erupted cheers, screams, flags waving in every direction. But Lewis barely heard them. His hands were still on the wheel, his eyes distant, his heart 1,000 miles away in Africa. Back in the winner's circle, cameras flashed like lightning. Reporters swarmed. Everyone expected him to talk about the race, the tires, the strategy, the thrill. But when the mic was placed in front of him, Lewis took a breath and dropped a sentence that made headlines in seconds. We need to look to leaders who challenge the status quo. People like Ibrahim Traoré. There was a pause. Journalists blinked. One even lowered their camera. Ibrahim Traoré, the young African leader. That wasn't the kind of name usually mentioned on race day. But Lewis wasn't here for usual. The camera zoomed in closer. You could see the fire behind his eyes. This wasn't just a soundbite, it was a call. A message. A moment. And thousands of miles away, in the capital of Burkina Faso, that moment landed. Ibrahim Traoré sat in his modest office in Ouagadougou, surrounded by papers and books, maps of the Sahel, handwritten notes, historical texts. He wasn't watching the race. He didn't even know it had ended. But someone showed him the clip. He watched it once, then again, and slowly, a smile appeared. It wasn't just about being named. It was about being seen, being heard, being understood. He picked up a pen. It would be an honor to welcome Lewis Hamilton to our homeland. The sentence was quiet, handwritten, almost poetic, but it carried weight. Because it wasn't just an invitation, it was recognition, a gesture of respect, of unity. And somewhere in London, across oceans and cultures, a thread had been tied between two men, two symbols who had never met, but somehow spoke the same language. Legacy, justice, rooted pride. The story wasn't in the win. The real story had just begun, with a sentence whispered after the race. And the world, it was listening. In the heart of Ouagadougou, as the midday sun cast long shadows across the presidential courtyard, Ibrahim Traoré sat alone in his study. No cameras, no speeches, just a man with a pen and purpose. The air was thick with the scent of paper, and dust books lined every wall. Documents piled beside a steaming cup of black tea. But it was the glowing screen in front of him that held his focus. Hamilton's words stared back at him. People like Ibrahim Traoré. It wasn't noise. It wasn't fluff. It was real. A global icon had just said his name. Not out of protocol, but from conviction. And in that moment, something shifted. The kind of shift you can't measure, but you feel. With calm hands, Traoré reached for a pen and began to write. It would be an honor to welcome Lewis Hamilton to our homeland. No fanfare. No committee. Just ink on paper and a man speaking directly to another man across continents. But outside that room, the wheels were already turning. A few streets away, in a shared workspace, buzzing with laptops and ideas, a young journalist named Sarah Dio gasped aloud. She had just seen the clip and then read the president's response. Her hands flew across the keyboard. "This is more than a conversation," she whispered. "This is the start of something much bigger." She wasn't wrong. Back in London, Hamilton's longtime advisor, Marcus Johnson, stared at the headline glowing on his phone screen. His brow tightened. He picked up the phone. "Louis," he said, voice low. "We need to talk." Minutes later, on a private video call, Marcus leaned in. "This message, it's powerful, but it could be seen as political. Are you ready for that?" Hamilton didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed locked on the screen, on Traoré's handwritten words. He nodded slowly. "It's not about politics," he finally said. "It's about connection. About truth." Meanwhile, in a cozy cafe tucked in the corner of Paris, Awa Traoré, niece of the Burkinabe president, showed the message to her friends. A hush fell over the group. This is history," someone whispered. But Awa's heart beat faster. She knew her uncle. This wasn't for show. He meant it. And across oceans, in newsrooms, dorm rooms, and dinner tables, people began asking, what does it mean when a Formula One champion answers the call of Africa? Nobody knew yet. But one thing was certain. The silence before the storm had passed. The conversation was now global and unstoppable. The message had left the palace, but it hadn't stopped moving. It was growing, stretching, weaving its way into places no one expected. In Ouagadougou, Saradio's phone buzzed nonstop. Journalists were calling, activists, students, even farmers from the outskirts. Everyone had seen the clip. Everyone had read the response. Sarah wasn't just writing an article, now she was chasing a movement. At the university, a professor leaned forward during an interview. Eyes sharp. "This is more than diplomacy," he said. "This is a statement of identity." Sarah nodded, scribbling notes furiously. Heart pounding. She wasn't documenting politics, she was documenting awakening. Meanwhile, in a boardroom in London, Marcus Johnson's team stared at a digital map marked with social media surges. Burkina Faso was lit up like a signal flare. He turned to Hamilton on a Zoom call. "If you respond, it could be seen as taking a side." Hamilton's jaw tightened. He looked down, then back up, his voice steady. "It's not about sides. It's about where I come from, who I am, and far away." In Paris, the conversation was heating up. Awa Traoré sat in a crowded student cafe. Her uncle's letter was on her screen, and everyone was talking over each other. Some were skeptical. Others were electrified. Is this really Pan-Africanism? Or just politics in disguise? Someone challenged. Ava didn't flinch. She stood, holding her phone. "My uncle doesn't chase headlines. He builds. He believes." Silence fell. No one doubted her then. But the most intense debates weren't happening in public, they were happening behind closed doors. Inside the presidential office in Ouagadougou, Traoré sat at the head of a long wooden table. Advisors lined both sides. Papers in hand. Voix tense. "We must tread carefully." One of them warned, "This could spiral." Traoré listened, then leaned forward. "If we're too afraid to speak, we stay in the shadow forever." His voice was calm but sharp, like steel under silk. Back in London, Hamilton stared at a blank document. He knew every word mattered. This wasn't a press release, it was a promise. He thought of the boy he used to be, of his father, of every young black kid who never saw themselves reflected in power. "This matters," he whispered. And then he began to write, line by line, word by word, with care, with fire, because this wasn't about just him or Traoré. It was about all of them. And the world was waiting. The night in London was quiet. But Lewis Hamilton's mind wasn't. He sat alone in his apartment, lights dim, phone silent. The letter from Ibrahim Traoré glowing on his screen. It would be an honor to welcome Lewis Hamilton to our homeland. He'd read it a dozen times, but it still felt heavy. Not like a compliment, more like a call to purpose. He leaned back, exhaled, stared at the ceiling. This wasn't just about crossing a finish line. This was about crossing a threshold. Across town, Marcus Johnson paced his office. His gut twisted. The headlines were multiplying. Reactions flooding in from every corner: praise, criticism, confusion. He dialed Lewis. Once you respond, Marcus said, there's no turning back. This isn't racing. This is global. Lewis didn't answer at first. Then finally, I know. And I'm ready. In Paris, Awa Traoré lit a candle on her windowsill. Something her grandmother used to do during moments of change. She opened her laptop and began planning. This is bigger than us, she whispered. She started organizing virtual gatherings, bringing together young minds across the diaspora. Artists, writers, students, farmers, people who saw themselves in both men, Hamilton and Traoré, each from different worlds, yet somehow walking the same road. And in Ouagadougou, inside the palace walls, a different kind of storm was brewing. Traoré's advisors were now in full crisis mode. We're inviting K's. One said, what if this sparks backlash? Another chimed in. International partners are watching. We need control. But Traoré remained still. He looked at the letter from Hamilton. Still unsent. Then he looked out the window. Into the night sky above Africa. We don't need control, he said softly. We need truth. He turned back toward them. Eyes sharp. This is not about politics. This is about presence. Let them watch. Back in London, Hamilton hovered his fingers over the keyboard. Every sentence he wrote felt personal. Every line pulled from a place deeper than racing. He wasn't just replying. He was revealing himself. Finally, before sunrise, he pressed send. His voice echoed through the words, your message has deeply touched me. Though our paths differ, we share a purpose to fight injustice and to build bridges. I humbly and hopefully accept your symbolic invitation. As dawn broke over the London skyline, a single notification buzzed on Traoré's phone. He opened it. He read it. Then he smiled slowly, quietly, because in that moment, something invisible but undeniable had just been born, and the world was about to feel it. The sun had just crested over Ouagadougou, casting a golden hue through the windows of the presidential residence. Birds chirped faintly in the distance as Ibrahim Traoré, still in his morning robe, sat at a small table with a cup of black coffee. His phone buzzed. One notification. It was from Lewis Hamilton. He opened it, and for a moment, everything else stopped. He read it aloud to the room of aides now gathering quietly behind him. Though our paths differ, we share a purpose to fight injustice and to build bridges between peoples. I humbly and hopefully accept your symbolic invitation. Silence fell. A long, reverent silence. Traoré, placed the phone gently on the table, his voice calm, but carrying weight. This is more than a message exchange. It's a turning point. Across the city, Sarah Dio had barely slept. Her eyes were bloodshot, but her spirit was alive. She'd just received Hamilton's response, and her fingers were already typing. She hit publish on the article that would headline across West Africa. Hamilton responds, unity over borders. Then she packed her gear and left. She wasn't done writing. She wanted to feel the story now, so she took her camera and went deep into the countryside. There, she interviewed farmers, students, artisans, ordinary people who had seen something extraordinary. One elder woman weaving a rug looked up and said, "When leaders speak from the heart, it makes us feel less alone." Back in Paris, AWA Traoré watched the video side by side, Hamilton in his studio, Traoré in his office. 2 screens, 2 voices, 1 message. We don't need to be in the same place to be on the same path. Awa said during a virtual summit she'd organized that night. Activists from New York, Lagos, Kingston, Cape Town, and Toronto filled the Zoom screen, sharing stories, strategies, tears, and ideas. And across the ocean in London, Marcus Johnson stood at a podium facing a packed press conference. Reporters shouted over one another. Was it coordinated? Is Hamilton making a political stand? He raised a hand and simply said, "Lewis is using his platform to say something human, that we're all part of a larger story." The message had become a movement, invisible, unstoppable, undeniable, an electric current running across continents. 2 men had exchanged words, but millions felt them. The conversation was no longer between a driver and a president. It was between all of us and the world. It was wide awake now. The videos dropped within seconds of each other. 2 screens, 2 continents, 1 heartbeat. In London, Lewis Hamilton appeared in a dimly lit studio. No fancy backdrops, just him, raw, grounded, real. He looked into the camera, took a breath, and began. When I look at leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, I see strength, not the kind you flaunt, but the kind you carry. Quiet, unshakable. His voice cracked ever so slightly. Behind his words, images rolled across the screen, children laughing in dusty villages, women weaving under the sun, young men rebuilding schools by hand. No narration, just life. Unfiltered, beautiful. Then, in Ouagadougou, President Traoré's face filled another screen. He sat in his office, surrounded not by gold or marble, but by maps, books, and worn wood. He stared into the lens, not as a president, but as a son of Africa. Lewis Hamilton reminds us that no matter where we go, our roots go with us. And it is in those roots that we find power. As he spoke, the video cut to crowds of children waving flags, dancers in traditional dress spinning under the sky, hands raised in song. Across the globe, people weren't just watching, they were feeling it. In a dark room in Ouagadougou, Sarah Dio had her headphones on, tears streaking her cheeks. She wasn't just witnessing history, she was part of it. The footage she had helped gather, those farmers, those children, was now on the world stage. And they weren't statistics anymore. They were alive. That night, She hosted a private screening at a local community center. People stood shoulder to shoulder, breath held tight. As the final scenes played, some clapped, others cried, but no one left unchanged. In Paris, Traoré took it further. She hosted a virtual vigil. Hundreds of young people joined in from across the diaspora. They didn't chant. They shared stories, hopes, scars. This proves we can change the world, AWA said softly. Even if we're not in the same place. One by one, they lit candles from their homes, screens filled with flickers of light, different cities. Same flame. Even Marcus Johnson, watching quietly from a hotel room in Geneva, couldn't hold back a smile. We're building something greater than any of us, he told his team later. And no headline can capture it. The fire had been lit, and now it was spreading. Unstoppable. By now, the world wasn't just watching it, was engaged. The videos had gone viral, not by accident, but by design. A coordinated global drop. Maximum reach. Maximum impact. And it worked. Within hours, the comment sections turned into forums. Not just praise, but plans. Not just reactions, but responses. People weren't scrolling. They were organizing. Back in Ouagadougou, Sarah Dio couldn't walk 10 steps without being stopped. A farmer handed her a hand-carved necklace and said, "Give this to Hamilton if you ever meet him. Tell him we're proud." She choked up but kept moving. Her camera never left her side. She was making something real. Shared roots. Her documentary was no longer just a project. It was a living, breathing testimony. She traveled deep into rural villages, capturing faces that the world had never seen, but would soon never forget. Old women weaving, children studying in candlelight, young men speaking about justice with eyes full of fire. And they all had one thing in common. They'd heard the message. In Paris, Awa Traoré expanded her mission. She wasn't just hosting calls anymore. She was building a network. Weekly events, digital hubs, open forums. During one live stream, she read aloud from the letter Hamilton sent. "This proves we don't need to be physically present to stand together," she said, across the screen. Dozens of youth nodded. From Brooklyn to Bamako, Cape Town to Compton. They didn't need to meet in person. The connection was already there. And then came the flood. Letters, emails, voice notes. From kids, from parents, from strangers. Back in Ouagadougou, President Traoré sat in a meeting room, holding a stack of handwritten letters. Each one, from a child. He read them aloud to his team. One simply said, "I didn't know people like me could matter until now." Another, from a 10-year-old girl named Fatou, "Thank you for reminding us that we can dream big." His voice broke slightly at that one. He looked around the room, then stood. "This isn't just about Lewis Hamilton or me," he said. "It's about unlocking something that was buried in all of us." Then, he launched a national youth initiative. Scholarships, creativity grants, rural education boosts. It was no longer about symbolism. Now it was action. And far away, in London, Lewis Hamilton read one of those same letters and smiled through tears. Because now he knew the spark they had lit. It had become a flame. It wasn't just a spark anymore. It was a movement with momentum. Sarah Dio, eyes tired but burning with purpose, stood before a packed hall in New York City. Her documentary, Shared Roots, had just finished screening. The applause was thunderous, but the silence afterward was even louder. That sacred moment when impact settles in. A man in the crowd stood up and asked, "What made you follow this story?" She held the mic tightly, her voice steady. "Because I wanted to show the world that even separated by oceans, we are part of the same soul." The crowd rose to their feet. Her words weren't just an answer, they were a mirror. And across the Atlantic, others were seeing themselves reflected too. In Paris, AWA Traoré was becoming something more than an organizer. She was a force. Students looked to her for leadership. Journalists followed her events. Diplomats requested interviews. But she remained grounded, always reminding people. This started with a letter. Now, it's a legacy. At an international conference on the African diaspora, AWA stood behind a podium. Heart pounding. "My journey began the day my uncle reached out to Lewis Hamilton," she said. "But now, it belongs to all of us." Cameras flashed. Social media lit up. Number, Shared Roots, trended globally, again. Meanwhile, Marcus Johnson sat quietly in Hamilton's private suite, going through stacks of mail. Letters from children, elders, communities, organizations. Each one thanking Lewis for daring to be more than a champion on the track. He looked up. "You know, I was wrong," he said. Hamilton smiled, leaning back in his chair. "No," he replied. "You were careful. I just knew, this time. We couldn't be." They both laughed, but it wasn't light. It was the kind of laugh you exhale after holding your breath for too long. Then came the final stroke. Marcus slid a folder across the table, inside official documents, to establish a new foundation in Hamilton's name. Roots of the Future. Mission Education. Economic Empowerment. Cultural Representation. Hamilton didn't speak. He just nodded. The decision had already been made in his heart. And somewhere far from the cameras, in a small Burkinabe village, little Fatou stood inside a brand new classroom built with funds from the foundation she never knew existed. She held a pencil like it was a wand, because to her, it was. And the dream she once thought too far away was now sitting in her very hands. Months passed, but the energy never faded. If anything, it deepened. In Burkina Faso, new classrooms stood where empty lots once were. Chalkboards where silence had lived. Laughter now echoing in places that once knew only stillness. And in one of those classrooms, a 10-year-old girl named Fatou sat proudly in the front row, her braids tied with yellow ribbon, her notebook open. Her dreams no longer whispered, but written boldly across the page. She had written a letter. Simple, honest, carefully printed in her best handwriting. "Thank you for reminding us that we can dream big." The letter made its way to London, translated, carried, and delivered by hand. When Hamilton opened it, he didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stared at those words until they blurred with tears. It wasn't a podium. It wasn't a trophy. It was truth. That night, he shared the letter with his team. "I used to race for glory," he said. "Now, I race for this, across the world." Traoré stood before a gathering of young leaders in Ouagadougou, some still in school. some returning from abroad, all carrying questions about their place in the world. He didn't speak like a president. He spoke like a brother. The road ahead is long, he said. But every step we take together, every bridge we build, moves us closer to a future where no child has to ask if their dreams are too big. They rose to their feet. He didn't ask them to, but they did. In New York, Shared Roots was nominated for international awards. During a panel, Sarah Dio was asked how it all began. She held up a printed screenshot Hamilton's words and Traoré's reply. She smiled. With a sentence, she said, and the courage to mean it. In Paris, Awa returned home for the summer. She walked through the very villages she once only heard about in stories. At one stop, a group of children surrounded her, singing traditional songs under a mango tree. She laughed, then cried, then promised, "This is just the beginning." In a world obsessed with power, something else had risen. Connection. Two men never having met in person had changed the narrative. Not with policy, not with protest, but with presence. And as Sarah's final line in the documentary played on screens around the globe, a quiet hush would always follow. The roots we share may be invisible, but their branches now touch the world. And in every corner of that world, something had begun to grow.